Hi class. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Chapter 6, Reconstructing Women's Lives North and South, and I'm also going to talk about the preceding 5 chapters. We are now halfway done with the book and with the course. Your midterm is going to be due on May 12th, and it's just a one-page essay sort of thing, and there'll be a lot more instructions on how to do that on Angel. So I wanted to take a look at the development of the women's rights movement so far, up to the point where we stop, which is around 1900. The first right that women started to fight for was the right for married women to own property. If you'll recall, in the first few chapters of the book, we learned that English married women were subject to a law called femme couverte, which meant covered lady, as in all her stuff is covered by her husband, he'll take care of everything. And so these women did not have any political or economic rights of their own. And this was tricky in cases where they might have an inheritance from their father, or in the case of widows who might inherit from their husbands and then want to marry again. These women wanted control of their own property rather than having their husbands control everything. And the first 2 states to allow this were both southern states, to give women more control over the slaves that they inherited from their fathers. So with the right for women to own property, this is something that started to build. That's one element of the early women's rights movement. And the other one grows from the abolition movement. The abolition movement is the movement to free slaves, to end slavery altogether. And women were very active in this movement. Unfortunately, their positions within the movement were usually subordinate to those of men. And the more active women got a lot of grief from trying to speak in front of men or trying to participate in meetings on equal terms with men. And they started to wonder, why should men have all the power? Isn't abolition something that affects both sexes equally? And so why should we be subordinate in this case? And within the abolition movement, they started to seek greater representation and greater equality. At the same time, the abolition movement transitioned from being one that was largely about moral persuasion to one that focused on the law. And as people started trying to pass legislation to end slavery, women realized that they really needed the vote in order to be equal participants in the abolition movement. So that is where the first real move to get women the right to vote comes from. At the end of the Civil War, African Americans were free, and Congress was focused on getting voting rights for them. And the women who'd been involved in the abolition movement started to become involved, saying that at this moment, this is a good time to also give women the vote and to give women political rights. And the radical Republicans in Congress were not interested in going along with this, and so women were left behind and did not get the vote in the 1860s. Now, in the 1860s, and especially the 1870s, the women's club movement really starts to take off. And in the beginning, most of these clubs were not particularly interested in women's suffrage. That was a small, relatively small portion of the women who were active in these clubs, were active in the women's suffrage movement. Most of them were interested in a wide variety of other causes. Many of them were civic causes. And so women who were interested in, for example, the temperance movement, getting rid of alcohol, or in improving sewage and cleanliness of the cities, they found ways through these clubs to get their opinions heard and to get their goals realized. But after a while, they started to see that especially things like temperance and issues in the city, those depend on being able to vote. And so many of these clubs also turned and supported women's suffrage. The Women Christian Temperance Union, which is the largest women's organization and was focused on the prohibition of alcohol, they themselves endorsed women's suffrage about 10 years after they were incorporated. They realized that this was the primary way for them to achieve their goals. Now, in Chapter 6, we also see some other elements of progress for women, especially in the areas of education. And these are going to combine with the women's suffrage movement in the second half of our class to become the women's rights movement and eventually the feminist movement. I think it's really neat to see how all these things started and how they all kind of came together. How in the beginning, just asking for property rights eventually becomes a desire for an education and an equal political voice, and an equal voice in society as well. So I hope you're enjoying this chapter as well, and I look forward to reading your discussions this week.